Hello and welcome to this special show on Rajya Sabha Television. I am Vishal Dahiya, and in this particular show, we bring you all the aspects of India's fight against COVID-19 in terms of the technological interventions, the work which is being done on drugs or finding a new vaccine, as well as the work which is being done on the ground by our COVID warriors, the health workers, the administrative force, as well as the common people as well, who are putting their best foot forward. So today's show is focused on one very important and interesting aspect of this entire pandemic situation. That is with respect to the startup ecosystem, the startups in India. How have they fared in the past few weeks, and what has been the effect of the COVID-19 situation on them, specifically the challenges ahead? For this, we have a distinguished set of guests with us. Let me first introduce the guest to you, beginning with Mr. Anil Agrawal, the Joint Secretary with DPIIT from the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, somebody who handles the entire Startup India situation and the scenario out there. We also have with us Mr. Mahendra Swarup. He's the chairman of Startup Association of India, representative of the startups which work in India or which have come up in the past few years or so. We also have with us a young representative from Niti Aayog, Ms. Dutt. She's the public policy consultant in economics and finance with the Niti Aayog. Let me begin the show now, and let me begin with you, Mr. Swarup, to try and understand as to how has been the situation for the startups in India, specifically in the post-COVID scenario and during the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdown period as well. And what is it that the bigger challenges right now for the startups are in India?
Thank you for having me on the show. And it's a privilege to be on the show with Mr. Agrawal, who has been leading the initiative on startups for many years. And he's a very respected person in the startup ecosystem. He has made a lot of efforts, especially in the current scenario. I think DPIIT has been in the forefront of helping the startups. They have had several video conferences with the members of the Startup Association. And I think, thank you very much, Mr. Agrawal, for being so actively taking part in trying to revive the startup ecosystem. To answer the question, I think this is an unprecedented kind of a crisis which has come. And as you know, startups are young companies with very little spare cash because they depend on capital. And capital comes from venture capital funds, which, as Mr. Agrawal would know, almost 90% of the capital which startups get is from foreign venture capital. I think one of the things which we should do, and that's what the Startup Association has been asking for, is a big impetus for domestic venture capital funds to actually start putting money into Indian startups. So that is already available. The packages which has been announced by the government recently, especially by the Honorable Finance Minister, I think it's welcome that credit lines have been opened up, and hopefully that the credit lines and loan schemes which have come for the MSMEs will also be available to startups. I think we need some clarity from Mr. Agrawal. It's a privilege that he's there today and he can clarify that. And if that line is available, then I think that's a good lifeline for the startups. Because the startups are looking forward to some kind of a lifeline coming their way. And if this fund, which the government has announced on the MSME, is available to startup, that's a very welcome step on behalf of the government. Mm-hmm. I think it's a real crisis. Our belief is that NASSCOM recently came out with a survey. Almost about 60% of the startups may get wiped out because they have cash only left for the next 3 months. If the COVID crisis continues beyond 3 months, then most of these startups would find themselves going without cash and they will have to probably close operations. One of the biggest fear which I have is currently that if that happens and the government doesn't intervene immediately to actually salvage the situation, then a lot of innovation will die out of the country. As you know, startups have ideas which which lead the innovation in the country. And I think it's government should look at it is that they're coming and saving the innovation environment in the country rather than looking at as startups as a group of businesses. Mm-hmm. Actually, what it should come is to help the innovation and preserve and conserve and survive, help survive the innovation ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so startups obviously are about innovation. You spoke about that NASSCOM report and how the impact has been. Obviously, the crunch of funds is one aspect, and we'll go to Mr. Agarwal for a clarification on those MSME funds which you pointed out. Is that a credit line available for the startups as well? But if you look at sector-wise, Mr. Swarup, before we go to Mr. Agarwal, some reports also suggest that two specific sectors, the startups in two specific segments, seem to have taken the biggest hit. That's retail and fintech.
I think, yes, retail and fintech are two aspects of or the verticals which we call in the startup ecosystem. Fintech has taken a big hit because of the NBFC crisis. And with the Reserve Bank announcing a lot of initiatives in that respect, the liquidity has now come into the market, and hopefully the liquidity will increase. Fintech will revive itself because digital payments and digital way of working, especially in the financial sector, will keep increasing. So I think the government is very aware of the situation and they are taking the right steps. And the governor's initiative, the Reserve Bank governor's initiative, in increasing the liquidity in the hands of the banks and thereby into the hands of the NBFCs, are a very welcome step, because the startup ecosystem in the fintech verticals entirely is dependent on the liquidity in the NBFC sector. So that's a very welcome step, right? Retail, I think, because of the lockdown, e-commerce especially suffered because deliveries were not allowed. Deliveries were only allowed of essentials. Now, with the lockdown getting lifted in stages, e-commerce is coming back, right? And I think the e-commerce sector, or the retail sector, as we call it, is the only sector which is hiring people. So we recently learned that Amazon is going to be hiring 50,000 more people. So if one part of startups is losing jobs, there'll be another part of startups which will be hiring. So my belief is that if the right kind of impetus comes from the government of India, the startups in this crisis situation will become net hirers and employers rather than people losing jobs in startups.
Okay, right kind of impetus and push there required from the government, as Mr. Swarup is pointing out. Let's go to the government representative here, Mr. Agrawal, who's been part of this entire startup ecosystem, as Mr. Swarup also pointed out. So, Mr. Agrawal, the government's view as far as the situation in which the startup ecosystem or startups are right now, and what is the strategy from the government's side in in tackling those challenges which the startups are facing right now, be it the credit crunch, which is the major one, and clarity on some points which Mr. Swarup pointed out in terms of MSME funds, whether or not they'll be available for startups as well.
Yes. See, let me put things in perspective. Startups in the country are the flag bearers of our economy. In one of the events that we had in December last year, everybody spoke that, there are challenges in economic growth, economic situation, and the current scenario. Please go a little back about 3 months ago. Now, even in that situation, when you looked at startups and those who are investing in startups, they said, which slowdown are you talking of? So startups are a different economy altogether. They thrive on innovation. They thrive on the inherent strength of the new solution that they provide for current situation. So actually, those who have innovative solutions will never be out of the market. They will always have customers and they will always have the wherewithal to stand up to the situation. Now, one of the major situations that has arisen because of the lockdown and the COVID situation is fundamentally it is a liquidity issue. I mean, as all businesses are finding it difficult to pay rents, to pay salaries, to pay the fixed costs at the same time when, there are challenges in getting revenues. But, startups are the most agile component of our economy. They are the ones who have very dynamically and very quickly adapted to the situation. Those who have adapted have survived also. I have so many examples of them who have done so well in this crisis situation. Now, we've been watching this entire thing, and right from day one, from the government's point of view, it was not just to support the startups, it was also to look at the best of our startups and utilize their innovation for managing the situation which is coming out of COVID-19. Now, as you may have heard now, we are self-sufficient in production of PPEs. We are self-sufficient in production of N95 masks. How is this coming up? We are now likely to be producing ventilators on a large scale very shortly. Now, these are all startups which are there in different areas of the country who have been supported by the government in various forms that we are getting there. In management of COVID, we have had not just the medical part. There is people are under lockdown, they are under containment zones, they have to be given essential supplies. Now, we've been able to mobilize, as it was pointed out, that e-commerce could not do it because e-commerce, the bigger companies are confined to bigger areas. Now, containment zones are across the country, and they are there in tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, everywhere, all these places. Now, there are people who are contained, who are confined in the containment zones. You need to give them essential services. Now, who provides all this? More than 90% of the retail trade is done by those who are not on e-commerce. So all that was done during this period, and there was no problems during this. So, this perception that startups are not able to survive this is not entirely correct. Secondly, I will tell you, the major packages that have been announced by the government actually is a 360-degree thing. Now, starting from the measures to increase liquidity in the system, which will ultimately help all the startups, all businesses actually. And then there is a very specific package for MSMEs. The thing that has happened there is that a definition of an MSME is now aligned with the definition of a startup. Now, this is one of the biggest reforms that has happened. Very big reform. Now, a startup as it is defined today was up to a turnover of 100 crores, right? That is what a startup is, who is using essentially a technology and based on innovation. And MSME was defined, up to now with a investment in plant and machinery up to 10 crores. Now, what they've said is the government says that now it is investment up to 20 crores and a turnover of up to 100 crores. So, all startups will fall into the category of MSME, and all the benefits that have been announced for MSMEs will ultimately be available to startups. Now, this is a very big thing. And if you look at the measures that have been announced for MSMEs, they are very, very, very substantial. So I would request all my colleagues from the startup ecosystem to have a look at that. We have had very intensive consultations with startup ecosystem, and there are other issues also. We are also working on a whole lot of other measures to take the startups.
Okay, we'll come back to that as well in terms of the long-term strategy which you must be talking about. Let's bring in Pankuri here. Pankuri, from your point of view and the way both the gentlemen have put the situation in perspective, one as to what the government has been doing to tackle the challenges which the startup ecosystem has been facing. So, what is your view on the situation right now which is there, and what more can be done? Obviously, the government has taken initiative. The impetus has been given. Starters have been brought at par with MSMEs. The definition has been changed. That opens a lot of doors in terms of ensuring that the liquidity is also there. But what more can be done? Is there a room for more to be done here?
We had to realize that startups are also a part of this, ecosystem where they are linked to MSMEs. They are linked they are linked to big businesses, and the government has also done enough to connect startups to big businesses so that the chain is not broken anywhere. And the packages that have been announced by the FM are also going to ensure that even the small businesses keep moving and they keep the momentum on with the startups and with bigger businesses as well. Now, what can be done is that we have to look at working capital, which is probably an issue that Mr. Swarup also pointed out. So working capital is something that might be looked at by banks. Then the other scenario that we have to be aware of is, there are lots of caveats and there are lots of covenants that startups have to comply with. So, relaxing some of them at this time, and, they might not be meeting the targets that they're supposed to. So, relaxing those is another suggestion that, financiers should consider, so that the hit is not majorly taken by these small firms.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Mr. Swarup, any more expectations in terms of policy initiatives or policy tweaks which can be done specifically with respect to the startup ecosystem there?
I think there are a couple of things which are very vital for the survival of the startups, as Pankaj said. And one issue which we startups always face is cash coming, and startups have very limited cash. So that is something which will immediately be required, that either the banking system comes to the rescue and extends special credit lines to startups. Although the package which has been announced is that you can get up to 3 crores without collaterals, but it is there is, if you read the fine print, it says that those people will only be given who are already have been given loans by the banks under the MSME registrations. So most of these startups actually do not leverage their balance sheet, and they don't go to the banks for debt. They live on capital. So capital infusion is something which is required, because they don't have revenues. For the first 3, 4, 5 years, these startups don't have revenues. What we know of are the larger startups who have some revenues. But for the startups, the real innovative startups start getting revenues in the 3rd, 5th, 6th, 7th year. So in the first 3, 4 years, there are no revenues to support the EMIs which will be required to be paid. Even if there's a moratorium, the ability of a startup to actually finance a debt, right, or to service a debt are almost zilch. They cannot service debt because they don't have revenues. So they only live on capital. And that's where I'm urging the government of India to actually come out with a capital infusion scheme into the startups, because startups cannot afford debt.
The capital infusion
whatever
scheme.
The package has been announced, I'm glad that Mr. Agrawal has clarified that under the new definition of MSMEs, a lot of service startups would fall within that category. So, but I think it will be important for the government to understand that most of these startups will not be able to take advantage of that package. Because they have no revenues and they'll have no means of servicing that debt.
Okay, let's have a response from Mr. Agrawal here on this aspect, and the suggestion which is coming in that a capital infusion scheme might be a solution, maybe a long-term approach here, or something else the government has in mind or on its table.
See, every startup has a different requirement. Now, while a point of view has been put forward that they need more capital than debt, there are a number of startups who feel they need more debt than capital because they don't want to dilute their equity. So actually, it is very startup specific. And we have been trying to add flow of debt to the startups. Now, we already have a 10,000 crore fund of funds specifically for startups, which has done very, very well. Recently, they have announced in the FM package a 50,000 crore for MSMEs. That is actually an equity infusion into MSMEs. Now, with startups qualifying as MSMEs, all this will go actually for the benefit of those who are actually needing equity. So, what he's saying is actually already done. Second thing is about credit, the credits to the startups. Now, we are working on a credit guarantee scheme for startups. So what will happen is, the government will guarantee loans, collateral-free loans to startups, which may be given by any member lending institution, which are in the form of banks or NBFCs or even AIFs. So, that is a comprehensive scheme that we are working on, and this will provide huge flow lines of debt to the startups. The third thing is, we are also working on that has also been announced by the government. We are also working on a seed fund for startups. So what happens is when in the initial stages, when we do when the startups need a lot of capital, the initial stage, when they are what is famously called as the valley of death, when the startup is investing their own money from all their friends, family, and they are not able to generate revenues. So it is that time during which they need the maximum support. And the Startups India Seed Fund scheme is essentially designed to cater to this, segment of the startups. So we are actually trying to cover holistic view, take a 360-degree view of the support that the government can give. At the same time, I must tell you one thing. The government has to keep an arm's length with individual companies or individual startups.
Okay, definitely. It is the business which ultimately, at the end of the day, and that model, the business model, will have to be successful. The government is doing all that it can, as Mr. Agrawal pointed out. Pankudi, from your point of view, a long-term approach from here onwards, because this has been quite a big setback for most of the startups, and the COVID-19 pandemic is not yet over. It has not yet gone away. It might stay with us for a few more months or few more weeks or few more days, but those effects might be felt a bit longer. So in terms of a long-term strategy, what would you suggest?
So for startups to survive, they have to now rethink the new business model. They have to come up with new strategies of, being able to continue their business or even expand into new opportunities that have been created. So you must have heard of a lot of startups which are now manufacturing PPEs, which are now into rapid testing kits, developing those, which are now into education technology. So people who can leverage this opportunity to cater their business and align them with these needs would be able to survive. Also, digital has become the new way of life, as all of us are learning now. So slowly, all of us are coming to terms that we have to go online, we have to connect digitally to able to expand our businesses and to continue with our businesses. So those are two long-term changes that I'm expecting.
Okay. Mr. Swarup, concluding comments from you in terms of the long-term strategy, which the startups will also have to adopt here onwards?
Yes, I think Mr. Agrawal is completely correct in saying that the startups are very agile. I think they are the quickest to adapt because they're small and they don't have legacy. And as every crisis also offers opportunities. I think for startups, this COVID has offered a lot of opportunities. A lot of startups have already, in our language, which we call pivoted, into different startup models. What they were following, they have very quickly changed their models. And there are a lot of startups we know of who have actually gone into delivery of essentials, which was not part of their original business plan. So they have adapted very, very fast into the developing situation. And we see a lot of opportunities in emerging things like genomics, biotechnology, health tech, right? All models in this space will change. Mm-hmm. And I think most of the good and progressive startups have actually been formed during the time of crisis.
Okay.
So, yes, I think we will see a lot of new startups coming in who are actually looking at opportunities which COVID offers, as we call the new normal, that consumer behavior will change, how people are looking at going and getting themselves entertained, how people will eat, how people will communicate. So all these will offer totally different opportunities. So no touch digital payments, right, will catch on. So the POS machines will get replaced by contactless machines. So there'll be a whole amount of innovation. And the reason I'm keep coming back is that Mr. Agrawal is there on this show, is that the new innovation which is required post-COVID will need a lot of infusion of capital.
Okay.
Right. And I think that's where I'm insisting upon that credit is leveraging, the balance sheet is good. Many funded startups, let me put it that way, would look for credits, right? But non-funded ones look for capital.
Okay.
So the people who have already got funding will not like to dilute their equity, right? Founders will like to preserve their equity. So they will love to have debt. And I'm glad that the government has actually come out with packages in that respect of giving credit to the more advanced startups who have been in existence for quite a few years and are well funded. I'm actually fighting and pleading the government more for the startups which are very innovative, which will come in the post-COVID era. Okay. Because most of the venture capital funds in India, the AIFs and others, will hesitate in investing today. They have legacy investments. They will like to put money back into the investments which they've already made to make those succeed. And the money is going to die out because most of this venture capital comes from overseas.
Okay.
So we need a big pool of domestic capital.
Definitely.
To be able to support the innovative startups post-COVID.
Okay, definitely. These are some very valid points out there in terms of, looking at this entire situation holistically. Thank you so much, Mr. Swarup, Mr. Agrawal, and Pankuri there as well for bringing the entire situation in perspective for our viewers. Specifically, what I can summarize it as by saying that the key words seemingly are innovation and change from here onwards for the startups. Obviously, the credit flow is something which all the new companies, specifically the startups, would require, the new ones which are coming up. And the government has some plans on its hands. Some of them have already been revealed in terms of making things easier for those existing startups. But the long-term approach might entail some more push as well. Thank you so much once again to all our panelists, and keep watching Rajya Sabha television. Also, keep following all the guidelines with respect to social distancing norms and others when you step out of your house, because this fight against COVID-19 pandemic is not yet over. Thank you.